Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The private language argument. Why you cannot invent words only you understand. A person decides to create a private language, a language for describing inner sensations that only the person can experience, and the person picks a letter, say S, and decides that S will refer to a particular sensation, a specific feeling that recurs occasionally, and whenever the sensation occurs, the person writes S in a diary. And the person is the only one who knows what S means. The only one who can identify the sensation, because the sensation is private, is accessible only to the person who feels it. And this seems possible, seems like something anyone could do. Seems like we already do this to some extent when we give names to our own private experiences, but Ludwig Wittgenstein argues in his philosophical investigations that such a private language is impossible. That the scenario described involves a fundamental confusion about how language works, about what it means for a word to have meaning. And this is the private language argument, one of the most discussed and controversial arguments in 20th century philosophy, a challenge to the idea that we can give meaning to words through private mental acts of association, through inner ostensive definition, and an argument that meaning requires public criteria, requires shared practices, requires more than individual intention or inner recognition. Imagine the person using S over time, writing it when the sensation occurs. And now the question arises, how does the person know they are using S correctly? How does the person know that today's sensation is the same as yesterday's sensation, that both deserve the label S, and the person consults memory, remembers what S means, remembers the sensation, and judges that yes, the current sensation matches, deserves the label S. But Wittgenstein asks what makes this judgment correct. What distinguishes correctly remembering what S means from merely seeming to remember correctly? And in a public language, there are external checks. Other speakers can correct mistakes, can point out when a word is misused. But in a private language, there is no external check. No way to distinguish genuine correctness from apparent correctness. No way to distinguish following a rule from merely thinking one is following a rule, and so the distinction collapses. And if there is no distinction between being right and seeming right, then there is no meaning, no rule, no language, only the illusion of language. The argument can be stated as a dilemma. Either the private language user has a criterion for correct use of S, something that determines when S applies and when it does not, or the user has no criterion, and if there is a criterion, then it must be something public, something that could, in principle, be recognized by others. Because private criteria are impossible, cannot distinguish correct from incorrect application, and so the language is not really private. And if there is no criterion, then S does not have a meaning, does not refer to anything determinate, is just a mark that the user writes arbitrarily. And either way, private language fails. Either it is not really private or it is not really language, and the conclusion is that language requires public criteria, requires embedding in shared practices, requires more than inner acts of association. Visualize the private language user checking whether to apply S, looking inward, consulting the memory of what S means, and judging that the current sensation matches. And Wittgenstein compares this to buying several copies of the same newspaper to check whether the first copy was telling the truth. The consultation of memory is not an independent check, not a genuine verification, because memory itself might be mistaken, and there is no way within the private framework to correct memory, no external standard against which to test it. And so the whole enterprise collapses into subjectivity, into whatever seems right is right. And this destroys meaning, makes S meaningless because there is no distinction between correct and incorrect use. The private language argument has profound implications for philosophy of mind, for theories of consciousness, for the question of whether mental states are purely private or whether they have public dimensions, and if private language is impossible, then purely private mental states are problematic, are not the kind of thing we can talk about or think about in determinate ways. And this suggests that even our inner lives, even our private experiences are shaped by public language, by shared concepts, by social practices. And there is no purely private realm of experience that exists independent of language and society. One response to the argument defends private language, argues that Wittgenstein's standards for meaning are too strict, that memory can serve as a criterion, even if it is fallible, that we do have private access to our sensations, and that this access, combined with memory, is sufficient to ground meaning. And this response denies that meaning requires public criteria, argues that private ostensive definition is possible, that we can give names to our inner states through acts of attention and association. And while these names might be incorrigible, might admit of no external check, they are still meaningful, still refer determinately to experiences, and the private language argument fails to show otherwise. Another response accepts that individual private language is impossible, but argues that this does not threaten our understanding of consciousness or inner experience, because we do not actually use private language, we use public language to describe our inner states, and words like pain and sensation have public criteria, have behavioural and contextual conditions for application. And so there is no need for private language, no loss if private language is impossible, and the argument's conclusion, rather than being threatening, is liberating, shows that language is essentially social, that meaning is public, and that our inner lives are not sealed off, but are accessible through language and behaviour. A third response questions whether Wittgenstein's argument succeeds, argues that it proves too much, that if private language is impossible, then all language is impossible, because even public language requires individuals to remember meanings, to apply rules based on memory and judgment, and if memory is insufficient for private language, why is it sufficient for public language? And this response suggests that the private language argument creates a general skepticism about meaning that Wittgenstein himself would reject, that the argument needs to be refined to distinguish the legitimate role of memory in public language from the illegitimate role in private language, and making this distinction is difficult. The private language argument also connects to broader issues about rule following, about what it means to follow a rule, to do the same thing repeatedly, to continue a series, and Wittgenstein's point is that rule following is not a matter of inner interpretation, not a matter of grasping a meaning in the mind, but is a matter of practice, of training, of embedding in a community, and rules are constituted by practices rather than by mental states, and following a rule is doing what counts as correct within a practice, not doing what seems correct to an isolated individual. And this social account of rules shapes Wittgenstein's philosophy of mathematics, of logic, of language, and underlies the private language argument. The person sits with the diary with entries of S scattered through the pages, and the question remains whether S means anything, whether the person is using language or merely making marks. And Wittgenstein's argument says that without public criteria, without shared practices, without the possibility of correction by others, S is meaningless. The diary is not a record but a pretense, and the private language is not language at all. And the argument persists as one of the most challenging and important arguments in philosophy, an argument that has shaped discussions of meaning, of mind, of consciousness, and of the relationship between language and reality. And whether the argument succeeds remains disputed, remains a matter of ongoing philosophical debate, but its influence is undeniable, has changed how philosophers think about private experience, about meaning, about the conditions that make language possible, and the private language argument endures as a permanent challenge to Cartesian conceptions of mind, to the idea of a purely private inner realm, and to theories that ground meaning in individual mental acts rather than in public practices. And the diary sits closed, the entries unreadable, meaningful, or meaningless depending on whether Wittgenstein is right, and the argument remains powerful and controversial, a landmark in 20th century philosophy. The repugnant conclusion, why creating billions of barely happy people seems better. A utilitarian philosopher sits with a calculator, attempting to determine which world is best, which future humanity should aim for, and the principle guiding the calculation is simple. Maximize total happiness, create the most good, ensure that the sum of well-being across all people is as large as possible. And this seems like a reasonable goal, seems like an obviously good principle. Who could argue against making the world contain more happiness rather than less? And yet when this principle is applied consistently, when the logic is followed to its conclusion, the result is deeply counterintuitive, deeply troubling. And this troubling result is called the repugnant conclusion, first articulated by philosopher Derek Parfit. And it says that for any world containing a population of people living excellent lives, lives of great happiness and fulfillment, there exists a better world, according to utilitarian calculation, containing a much larger population, living lives barely worth living, lives that contain only slightly more happiness than suffering. And the second world is better, because even though each person is much less happy, the total amount of happiness is greater due to the vastly larger population. And this conclusion seems repugnant, seems to violate our intuitions about what makes a world good, and yet it follows logically from the principle of maximizing total happiness. Imagine World A, containing 1 billion people, and each person lives a wonderful life, a life filled with love, and beauty, and meaning, and joy, a life worth living many times over. And the total happiness in this world is enormous. And now imagine World Z, containing 1 trillion people, and each person's life is barely worth living, contains just slightly more pleasure than pain, just enough satisfaction to make existence preferable to non-existence, but not much more. No deep relationships, no profound experiences, just a thin layer of positive feeling spread across a vast multitude. And when we calculate total happiness, World Z wins, because even though each person is much less happy, there are so many more people that the total sum is greater. 1 trillion barely positive lives sum to more total happiness than 1 billion excellent lives. And according to the utilitarian principle that says we should maximize total happiness, World Z is better than World A. We should prefer it, should work to bring it about. And this seems absurd, seems like a reduction to absurdity of the maximizing principle, and yet the logic is impeccable, follows directly from the idea that goodness is total happiness. Visualize the choice as a graph. On one axis is population size, on the other axis is average happiness per person, and World A has high average happiness and moderate population, and World Z has very low average happiness but enormous population, and the area under the curve represents total happiness, and World Z has more area, more total happiness, despite having much lower average happiness. And the repugnant conclusion says we should prefer the world with more area, more total happiness, even though this means accepting a vast population of people whose lives are barely worth living. And this seems to violate basic intuitions about human dignity, about quality of life, about what it means to create a good world. Because most people would rather live in World A, would rather be one of the 1 billion living excellent lives than one of the 1 trillion living barely positive lives. And a theory that says World Z is better seems to have gone wrong somewhere. Parfit called the conclusion repugnant because it seems to endorse a world that intuitively seems worse, seems to recommend creating vast populations, living lives of minimal quality, And this conflicts with our sense that what matters is not just total happiness, but how that happiness is distributed. How good each person's life is, whether lives are worth living in a robust sense, rather than barely scraping by. And the paradox forces a choice: either accept the repugnant conclusion and bite the bullet, admitting that yes, world Z really is better, and our intuitions are wrong, or reject total utilitarianism, reject the principle that all that matters is total happiness, and adopt some alternative that avoids the conclusion. But every alternative has costs, has its own counterintuitive implications. One response is to adopt average utilitarianism, which says what matters is not total happiness, but average happiness per person. And by this measure, World A is clearly better than World Z, because the average person in World A is much happier, and the repugnant conclusion is avoided. But average utilitarianism has its own problems. It implies that we can improve the world by killing unhappy people, because removing people whose happiness is below average raises the average. And this seems even more repugnant than the original conclusion. An average utilitarianism also implies that a world with one extremely happy person is better than a world with 1 billion moderately happy people, as long as the single person's happiness exceeds the average of the billion. And this seems wrong, seems to sacrifice too much for the sake of avoiding one counterintuitive conclusion. Another response is to adopt variable value principles, where the marginal value of adding a person depends on the quality of their life. Creating people with excellent lives adds more value per person than creating people with barely positive lives. And this can avoid the repugnant conclusion by making World A better than World Z, despite having fewer people, because the excellent lives contribute more value per person. But this approach requires specifying how the marginal value changes, requires drawing lines about which lives add how much value. And these lines seem arbitrary, and the approach faces technical difficulties, can generate cycles where A is better than B is better than C, and C is better than A, creating intransitive preferences that undermine rational choice. A third response is to reject consequentialism entirely, to argue that what matters is not just outcomes, not just how much happiness exists, but also rights, dignity, fairness. And these values are not captured by summing happiness and creating a world of 1 trillion people. Living barely worthwhile lives might maximize total happiness, but violates something important about human dignity, about what it means to respect persons. And this deontological response avoids the repugnant conclusion by appealing to values beyond happiness. But it must explain what these values are, how they are weighed against happiness, and whether they really should override considerations of total welfare. The repugnant conclusion also raises practical questions about population ethics, about how many people should exist, about whether we have obligations to create future people, and if so, what quality of life they should have. And these questions are not academic. They affect policy decisions about climate change, resource allocation, family planning, and sustainability. Because if creating more people is good, as long as their lives are worth living, then we should maximize population growth up to the point where additional people would lower everyone's quality of life below the barely worth living threshold. And this seems to recommend creating enormous populations living in poverty, which seems wrong. And if instead we think population should be limited to ensure high quality of life for each person, then we are rejecting total utilitarianism in favor of some other principle. And we need to say what that principle is and why it is right. Parfit himself was troubled by the repugnant conclusion, spent decades trying to find a population ethic that avoided it while remaining plausible, and he proposed various principles, but none fully satisfied him. And he concluded that population ethics is one of the hardest problems in moral philosophy, a domain where all theories seem to have deeply counterintuitive implications, and perhaps there is no fully satisfactory answer, no principle that aligns with all our intuitions, and we must choose which intuitions to preserve and which to sacrifice. And this choosing is itself a moral judgment, requires deciding what values are most important, and different people will make different choices based on different weights. They give to total happiness versus average happiness versus rights versus dignity. The calculator sits on the desk. The numbers are clear. World Z has more total happiness than World A. The calculation is not in doubt. And yet something rebels, something in us rejects the conclusion, insists that World A is better, that a world of 1 billion excellent lives is preferable to a world of 1 trillion barely positive lives, even if the total sum of happiness is less. And this rebellion reveals that our values are more complex than simple maximization, that we care about distribution, about quality, about more than just the sum, and the repugnant conclusion stands as a challenge to utilitarianism, as a reductio ad absurdum that forces reconsideration of the maximizing principle, and part of its legacy includes this unsolved problem, this paradox that shows the difficulty of systematizing our moral intuitions, the challenge of finding principles that match our judgments, and the repugnant conclusion remains, repugnant and unresolved, a permanent thorn in the side of consequentialist ethics. A reminder that maximizing happiness may not be as simple or as obviously right as it first appears. The problem of the one, why nothing can be truly unified. A philosopher asks the opposite question, not why there are many where we expect one, but why there is one where we observe many, asks how parts compose wholes, how multiplicity becomes unity, how many things can constitute one thing, and this is the problem of the one, the puzzle about unity, about what makes a collection of parts into a genuine single object rather than merely a plurality. And the problem is ancient, goes back to Greek philosophy, to debates about whether wholes are real or are merely conceptual constructions from parts. And the puzzle is that unity seems to require something beyond mere collection, requires a principle of unity that binds parts together. But what could this principle be? What makes a collection of atoms a person rather than merely atoms arranged person-wise? What makes a ship rather than merely planks fastened together? And if unity is not explained by parts alone, then what explains it? And if unity is just conceptual, just imposed by our minds, then objects are not real, are not mind-independent, and reality consists only of parts, of fundamental particles, and all composition is conventional. And this threatens ordinary ontology, threatens the reality of familiar objects. And this is the problem of the one, the challenge to explain how genuine unity arises from multiplicity, how the one emerges from the many. Imagine a statue, a bronze sculpture of a human figure, and ask what the statue is, and one answer says the statue is a collection of bronze atoms arranged statue-wise. The atoms are parts and the statue is the whole. They compose. But what makes this collection a statue rather than merely atoms? What unifies the atoms into one object? And the answer cannot be just spatial proximity, because atoms separated by empty space are still separate, not unified. And the answer cannot be just causal interaction, because atoms in different objects interact causally, through electromagnetic forces, without composing a single object. And the answer seems to require something additional, a principle of unity, a form in Aristotelian terms, or a substance in Cartesian terms, something that binds parts into wholes. But this additional element is mysterious, is not itself a physical part, and positing it seems like mysterious ontology, and avoiding it seems to require denying that wholes exist, accepting mereological nihilism, the view that only simples exist, only fundamental particles, and composition never occurs, and all talk of composite objects is loose speaking, is convenient fiction. The problem of the one connects to debates about composition, about when parts compose wholes, about what conditions must be met for composition to occur, and the problem is that every proposed answer seems either too permissive, allows too many compositions, allows arbitrary collections to count as objects, or too restrictive, disallows too many compositions, eliminates familiar objects, and finding the right balance, the correct answer to when composition occurs, has proven impossible. And Peter van Inwagen argued that this impossibility suggests composition rarely occurs, perhaps only when parts constitute living organisms, and ordinary inanimate objects do not exist, are not genuine wholes, are only simples arranged object-wise. And this revisionary ontology preserves unity for organisms, but eliminates most ordinary objects. And critics find this too extreme, too counterintuitive, too willing to deny the obvious existence of chairs and tables and planets. Visualize unity as a relation between parts that binds them into wholes. And the question is, what grounds this relation? What makes it obtain? And if the relation is fundamental, not reducible to other facts about parts, then we have expanded our ontology, have added relations to our list of basic entities. And if the relation is reducible, is just parts having certain properties, or standing in certain spatial or causal relations, then we can eliminate talk of wholes, can replace it with talk of parts and their relations. And the whole is not an additional entity, but is just the parts and relations described collectively. And this eliminativist approach solves the problem of the one by denying that unified wholes exist, accepting that only parts exist and unity is conceptual, is our way of organizing parts into groups. And objects are not discovered but constructed by our practices of grouping and naming. One response to the problem of the one embraces mereological universalism, argues that any parts whatsoever compose a whole, that composition always occurs, that for any collection of objects, no matter how disparate, there is a further object that they compose. And this position accepts vast ontology, accepts that there are objects, like the fusion of your left hand and the Eiffel Tower, bizarre, scattered objects that common sense would reject. And the advantage is that composition is simple, unrestricted, explained by a single principle. But the disadvantage is that most composite objects are not recognized by ordinary thought, are not natural kinds, are arbitrary fusions, and this threatens to make ontology too easy, too unconstrained, accepts too much rather than too little. Another response accepts that some compositions occur and others do not, that there are principal distinctions, that organisms compose wholes but arbitrary collections do not, that bonding or causation or functional integration grounds composition determines when parts unify into wholes, and this moderate position preserves ordinary objects, accepts that chairs and organisms exist while rejecting bizarre fusions. And the challenge is to state the principle precisely, to say exactly which compositions occur, and every proposed principle faces counterexamples, faces cases where intuition says composition occurs, but the principle says it does not, or vice versa, and no principle has won consensus, and the problem of the one persists as a challenge to find the correct theory of composition. A third response questions whether the problem has a solution, argues that composition is vague, is indeterminate, that there are cases where there is no fact of the matter whether composition occurs, where the boundary between unified whole and mere collection is fuzzy. And this response treats the problem of the one as showing that reality is indeterminate in certain respects, that not all questions about existence have determinate answers, and some philosophers embrace this, accept vague existence, while others reject it as incoherent, as violating the law of excluded middle, and the debate continues. The problem of the one also affects our understanding of ourselves, of persons, because persons seem to be unified wholes, seem to be single subjects of experience, despite being composed of many cells, many organs, many subsystems. And what unifies a person? What makes a collection of cells? One person rather than many cells. And the answer cannot be just physical contiguity, because persons survive cell replacement, survive gradual change in material composition, and the answer seems to require psychological continuity, sameness of consciousness, unity of perspective. But these are not physical properties, are not features of cells, and so persons might not be physical objects, might be non-physical entities that somehow relate to bodies, and this threatens materialism, threatens the view that persons are nothing over and above their physical parts. And the problem of the one for persons remains unsolved, remains a challenge for theories of personal identity. The statue stands, one or many, unified or merely assembled, and the person exists, one subject or many cells, and the problem of the one persists, asking how unity arises, how the many become one, how parts compose wholes, and no answer fully satisfies. No theory explains unity without mystery, without positing irreducible relations or denying obvious unities, and the problem endures as a central puzzle in metaphysics, a challenge to explain what we take for granted, that objects are singular, are unified, are more than mere heaps of parts, and perhaps unity is primitive, is inexplicable, is something we must accept without analysis. Or perhaps unity is illusory, is imposed by mind on parts that remain forever separate. And the problem remains, ancient and unresolved, a permanent fixture in ontology. The Simpsons paradox. A pharmaceutical company tests a new drug, comparing it to an existing treatment, and the study involves two populations, men and women, and when the results are analysed separately by gender, the new drug outperforms the old treatment in both groups. Men who take the new drug recover more frequently than men who take the old treatment, and women who take the new drug also recover more frequently than women who take the old treatment. And so it seems clear that the new drug is superior, effective for both men and women, better than the alternative, and yet when the data from both groups are combined, when the overall recovery rates are calculated across the entire study population, the old treatment appears to outperform the new drug, showing higher overall recovery rates. And this reversal, where a trend that holds in every subgroup disappears or reverses when the subgroups are combined, is Simpson's paradox, named after the statistician Edward Simpson, who described it formally in 1951, though the phenomenon had been noted earlier by others. And the paradox reveals how aggregating data can mislead, how the whole can tell a different story than the parts, and how statistical reasoning requires careful attention to confounding variables and the structure of causal relationships. The resolution of the paradox lies in understanding that the populations are not balanced, that more men than women take the new drug, or more women than men take the old treatment, or that the recovery rates differ between genders for reasons unrelated to the drugs. And this imbalance means that the overall average is dominated by the group with higher representation. And if men have higher recovery rates in general, and most men take the new drug, then the new drug will appear effective overall, even if it is actually less effective than the old treatment when gender is controlled for. Or if the distribution is skewed in other ways, the opposite reversal can occur. And the paradox shows that crude averages can be misleading. That Simpson's paradox occurs whenever there is a lurking variable, a confounding factor that influences both the treatment assignment and the outcome, and failing to account for this variable leads to incorrect conclusions. Consider a simpler example involving college admissions. Suppose a university has two departments, and Department A admits 70% of applicants, while Department B admits 30%. And when applications are examined by gender, it appears that the university discriminates against women, because the overall acceptance rate for women is lower than for men. But when the data are broken down by department, a different picture emerges. In Department A, which is less selective, a higher percentage of female applicants are admitted than male applicants, and in Department B, which is more selective, the same is true. Women are admitted at higher rates than men in both departments, and the overall appearance of discrimination arises because more women apply to Department B, which has a lower acceptance rate, while more men apply to Department A, which has a higher acceptance rate. And so even though women are favoured in both departments, they appear disfavoured overall. And this is Simpson's paradox. The confounding variable is the choice of department, which correlates with both gender and acceptance rate. And ignoring this variable produces a misleading aggregate statistic. The paradox has profound implications for how we interpret statistical data, for medical research where treatment effects can appear or disappear depending on how data are aggregated, for social science where trends in subgroups can reverse when combined, for legal cases where evidence of discrimination or bias can seem to vanish or appear depending on how populations are divided. And the paradox shows that there is no neutral or objective way to report statistics, that the choice of whether to aggregate or disaggregate, whether to control for certain variables or not, is a substantive decision that affects what conclusions can be drawn, and this decision should be guided by causal understanding, by knowledge of which variables are confounders and which are mediators. And this knowledge cannot be derived from the statistics alone, but requires background theory, domain expertise, and careful thinking about causal structure. Simpson's paradox also raises questions about the nature of causation and the relationship between correlation and causation, because the paradox shows that correlations can reverse when additional variables are considered, that associations in data are sensitive to what is held constant and what is allowed to vary. And this means that identifying causal relationships from observational data is more difficult than it might seem, that confounders must be identified and controlled for, that causal inference requires not just statistical analysis, but causal modelling, the specification of hypotheses about how variables influence each other. And the paradox is one reason why randomized controlled trials are considered the gold standard for establishing causation, because randomization ensures that treatment assignment is independent of confounding variables, breaking the associations that generate Simpson's paradox. The paradox appears in many real-world contexts. In sports statistics, where a player can have a better batting average than another player in every season, yet a worse average over their entire career, because they played different numbers of games in different seasons. In economic data where wages can increase for every demographic group, yet average wages can decrease overall because the composition of the workforce shifts toward lower wage groups. In epidemiology, where a treatment can appear harmful overall, yet beneficial in every subgroup, because sicker patients are more likely to receive the treatment. And in each case, the paradox reveals the danger of naive data interpretation, the risk of drawing conclusions from aggregate statistics without understanding the underlying structure. Some philosophers and statisticians argue that Simpson's paradox is not really a paradox, but a reminder of the importance of causal thinking, that the appearance of paradox arises only when we treat statistical associations as if they were causal relationships, that once we distinguish between correlation and causation, between conditional independence and causal independence, the paradox dissolves, and the correct answer to whether the new drug is better than the old treatment depends on the causal structure, on whether gender is a confounder that should be controlled for, or a mediator that should not be, and this depends on the mechanisms by which the drugs work and the reasons why gender affects recovery rates. Simpson's paradox has also been used to critique certain statistical practices, to question the use of aggregate statistics in policymaking, to highlight the need for transparent reporting of how data are broken down and what variables are controlled for, and to emphasize that statistical analysis is not a neutral technical exercise, but involves interpretive choices that reflect background assumptions and values, and different choices can support different conclusions, even from the same data. And this does not mean that statistics are arbitrary or that all interpretations are equally valid, But it does mean that statistical reasoning requires judgment, requires thinking about causal mechanisms, requires transparency about methods, and requires humility about the limits of what data alone can tell us. The data sit in tables, broken down by subgroups, aggregated across populations, and the numbers tell different stories depending on how they are arranged. And Simpson's paradox reminds us that statistics are not self-interpreting, that averages can mislead, that trends can reverse, and that understanding data requires more than calculation, requires causal reasoning, domain knowledge, and careful attention to structure. And the paradox persists as a warning, a puzzle that appears in textbook examples and real-world disasters, a reminder that numbers lie, or rather, that we lie to ourselves when we treat numbers as transparent windows onto reality rather than as constructed representations that must be interpreted with care. And the reversal of trends continues to surprise, continues to catch analysts off guard, continues to generate misleading headlines and faulty policies. And Simpson's paradox endures, not because the mathematics is obscure, but because the temptation to aggregate, to simplify, to collapse complex data into simple averages is overwhelming. And the paradox stands as a permanent challenge to that temptation, a proof that simplification can distort, that the whole is not always the sum of the parts, and that statistical reasoning, done properly, requires vigilance, sophistication, and an understanding of causation that transcends mere correlation. The St. Petersburg paradox. A casino offers a game with a simple rule. A fair coin is flipped repeatedly until it lands tails, and the player receives a payout that depends on the number of flips. If tails appears on the first flip, the payout is $2. If tails appears on the second flip, the payout is $4. If on the third flip, $8, and so on, doubling with each additional flip. And the question posed by the mathematician Daniel Bernoulli in 1738 is this: how much should a rational person be willing to pay to play this game? What is the fair price for a ticket? And the expected value calculation gives a shocking answer. The expected value is infinite, because the probability of tails appearing on the first flip is 1/2, and the payout is $2, contributing $1 to the expected value. And the probability of tails appearing on the second flip is 1/4, and the payout is $4, contributing another $1. And this pattern continues forever, each outcome contributing $1 to the expected value. And since there are infinitely many outcomes, the expected value is infinite. And yet no reasonable person would pay a large sum to play this game, let alone an infinite amount. And this gap between the infinite expected value and the finite amount people are actually willing to pay is the St. Petersburg paradox, a puzzle that challenged the theory that rational agents maximize expected value and led to the development of expected utility theory and the concept of diminishing marginal utility. The paradox reveals that expected value, calculated as the sum of each outcome's value multiplied by its probability, may not be the appropriate guide for decision-making, because expected value treats dollars linearly, assumes that $10 is worth exactly 10 times as much as $1, and that $1 million is worth exactly 1 million times as much. But this does not capture how people actually value money. For most people, the value of money exhibits diminishing marginal utility. The first dollar is worth more in terms of welfare than the second dollar, which is worth more than the third, and so on. And $1 million does not provide 1 million times as much satisfaction as $1. And when utility, rather than dollar value, is used to calculate expectations, the St. Petersburg paradox can be resolved. Because even though the dollar payouts grow without bound, the utility of those payouts may converge to a finite value, and so the expected utility of the game is finite. And a rational agent should be willing to pay at most that finite expected utility to play. Daniel Bernoulli proposed that utility is logarithmic in wealth, that the utility of having X dollars is proportional to the logarithm of x. And under this assumption, the expected utility of the St. Petersburg game is finite, and the fair price to play is modest, a few dollars perhaps, in line with what people are actually willing to pay. And this resolution saved the principle of expected utility maximization, showing that the paradox arises not from a flaw in decision theory, but from using the wrong measure of value, from confusing money with utility. And Bernoulli's insight laid the groundwork for modern economics and decision theory, which routinely assume that utility is concave in wealth, that people are risk-averse, that they prefer a certain outcome to a gamble with the same expected value, and that this risk aversion reflects diminishing marginal utility. But the St. Petersburg paradox has deeper layers, because even the expected utility resolution can be challenged. Mathematicians have constructed super St. Petersburg games where the payouts grow so rapidly that expected utility is also infinite, even under logarithmic utility or any concave utility function. For instance, if the payout on flip n is not 2 to the power of n dollars, but 2 to the power of 2 to the power of n, or some even faster growing function, then expected utility under any reasonable utility function will be infinite. And so the paradox reappears, and this suggests that the problem is not merely about the choice of value function, but about how to handle infinite or unbounded expectations. And some decision theorists argue that games with infinite expected value or utility are ill-defined, that they fall outside the domain of expected utility theory, that the theory was never meant to handle such cases and should not be faulted for failing to do so. Others propose alternative decision theories, bounded utility functions where utility approaches a maximum, as wealth increases so that no payout, however large, has infinite utility, and under such functions, all expected utilities are finite. And the paradox is avoided, or they propose maximum principles where the agent focuses on the worst possible outcome, or they appeal to considerations of probability and belief, arguing that rational agents should not assign positive probability to arbitrarily unlikely events, that there is some threshold below which probabilities are treated as zero, and this truncation of the probability distribution renders expected values finite. The paradox also raises questions about the feasibility of the game, because no casino could actually pay out arbitrarily large sums. The maximum payout is limited by the casino's resources, and once this limit is imposed, the expected value becomes finite, and the paradox dissolves. But this response feels unsatisfying, like avoiding the problem rather than solving it, because the paradox is meant to be a thought experiment about rational decision-making, not a practical question about casino economics. And thought experiments should not be dismissed simply because they involve idealizations. The St. Petersburg paradox connects to debates about rationality and the nature of value, about whether rationality requires maximizing expected utility or whether other principles should guide decision-making, about whether value is unbounded or whether there are limits to how much anything can be worth, about how to handle uncertainty and risk, especially when probabilities are very small and payoffs are very large. And these questions have implications far beyond gambling, for insurance, for investment, for policy decisions involving catastrophic risks like pandemics or asteroid impacts, where the probabilities are tiny, but the potential costs or benefits are enormous. And the paradox shows that expected value reasoning can give counterintuitive or unhelpful guidance in such cases, that we may need other frameworks, other ways of thinking about decision-making under extreme uncertainty. The coin is flipped, tails appears eventually, the game ends, the payout is made, and the player receives some finite amount, usually small, rarely large, almost never enormous, and the expected value, calculated before the game began, was infinite. But this infinity is never realized, never paid out, never experienced, and so the paradox asks whether infinite expected value is meaningful, whether it should guide decisions, whether a rational agent should treat an infinite expectation differently from a very large finite one, and the answers are not obvious, not settled, not agreed upon, and the St. Petersburg paradox remains a puzzle, a test case for decision theory, a challenge to the principle of expected value maximization, a reminder that infinity is strange, that unbounded sequences create problems, that mathematical idealizations can clash with practical intuitions, and that the gap between theory and behavior, between what agents should do according to formal models and what they actually do, reveals something important about the limits of rationality, the role of psychology, the nature of value, and the difficulty of making decisions in a world where outcomes can vary wildly, where probabilities can be minuscule, and where the mathematics of expectation, taken to its logical extreme, produces results that seem absurd, untenable, impossible to act on, and the paradox endures, studied in classrooms, debated in journals, unresolved despite centuries of attention, a permanent fixture in the philosophy of probability, economics, and decision theory. The stone paradox, another way to ask if God can defeat God's self. The question appears in different forms across centuries, always pointing to the same underlying puzzle about unlimited power, and one formulation asks whether an all-powerful being can create a stone so massive that even infinite strength cannot move it. And this is the stone paradox, essentially identical to the omnipotence paradox, but focusing specifically on physical objects and physical power. And the logic is the same. Either the being can create the unmovable stone, which means there is something the being cannot do, namely move the stone, or the being cannot create the unmovable stone, which means there is something the being cannot create, and in both cases the being's power has limits. And the concept of all-powerful collapses, and this formulation emphasizes the physical, intuitive aspect of the puzzle, makes it concrete, gives it visual force, because we can imagine trying to lift a stone, imagine straining against weight, and the idea of a stone too heavy for even infinite strength captures the paradox in a visceral way that abstract formulations about logical possibility sometimes miss. Imagine the stone, vast beyond imagining, extending across space, dense with compressed matter, so heavy that it curves space-time around itself, creates gravitational wells, warps reality by its mere presence, and the being approaches, grasps the stone, applies force, and the stone does not move, remains fixed in space, immovable. And this defeat, this failure, seems to show that the being is not all-powerful, and yet the being created this stone, shaped it specifically to be unmovable. And if the being can create such a stone, then the being has a power that contradicts itself, a power to create constraints that the power itself cannot overcome. And this self-defeating power seems incoherent, seems to be no power at all. And so we are driven back to the conclusion that creating such a stone is impossible, but then the being cannot create everything imaginable, cannot create every physical object, and again, the being is not all-powerful. The stone paradox is sometimes presented as a reductio ad absurdum of the concept of omnipotence, an argument that shows omnipotence is logically impossible, that no being could have unlimited power, that power must have limits, and if omnipotence is impossible, then no being is omnipotent, not even God. And this conclusion challenges traditional theology, challenges the claim that God is all-powerful, and requires either rejecting omnipotence as a divine attribute or redefining it in a way that avoids the paradox. And theologians have generally chosen the second option, have argued that omnipotence does not mean literally unlimited power, but rather maximal power consistent with logical coherence. And this means God can do anything that is logically possible, but not things that involve contradictions. And creating an unmovable stone that one can then move is a contradiction. And so God's inability to do it is not a limitation, but a reflection of logical necessity. The stone paradox also has variants involving self-limitation, questions about whether God can limit God's own power, can voluntarily give up omnipotence, can create a situation where God is no longer all-powerful. And these questions are theologically interesting because they relate to the incarnation, to the Christian claim that God became human in Christ. And being human involves limitations, involves not being omnipotent, and so did God limit divine power when becoming incarnate? And if so, does this mean God is no longer omnipotent? And if God can limit divine power, does this show that God is not essentially omnipotent? And these questions have generated extensive theological debate about the relationship between Christ's human nature and divine nature, about whether limitations apply to God as a whole or only to the human aspect. And the stone paradox in these variants touches on central mysteries of Christology and Trinitarian theology. The paradox can also be understood as a question about necessity and possibility, about whether there are constraints that even an all-powerful being must respect. And the response that God cannot do logically impossible things is a claim that logical necessity is more fundamental than power, that even God cannot violate logic. And this has implications for metaphysics, for the question of what grounds logical truths, whether they are independent of God or created by God. And if they are independent, then there is something God does not control, something that limits divine sovereignty. And if they are created by God, then the claim that God cannot violate logic becomes the claim that God cannot do what God has decided is impossible. And this seems to restore divine sovereignty, but raises questions about whether God could have made different logical truths, could have made contradictions possible. And these questions push the limits of coherent thought. Some philosophers have argued that the stone paradox shows that power itself is incoherent as an unlimited concept, that just as there cannot be a largest possible number, because any number can be exceeded by adding one, there cannot be an unlimited power, because any supposed unlimited power can be challenged by asking whether it can create a limit to itself. And this suggests that power is always relational, always defined relative to tasks and capacities. And the idea of absolute power, power not relative to anything, is an illusion, a category mistake. And so the paradox does not refute the existence of very powerful beings, does not show that God cannot be maximally powerful within the constraints of coherence, but it does show that certain formulations of omnipotence, certain claims about unlimited power, are not logically tenable. The stone sits in conceptual space, hypothetical and impossible, and the being stands before it, and the question hangs: can the stone be created? Can it be moved? And the answer shapes theology, shapes metaphysics, shapes our understanding of what power is and what limits even ultimate power must respect. And the stone paradox remains a vivid, concrete formulation of deep abstract questions about possibility, coherence, and the boundaries of divine ability. And it stands alongside the omnipotence paradox as a permanent challenge to simplistic claims about unlimited power. A reminder that even theology must answer to logic, that concepts must cohere, and that the nature of God, if God exists, is more subtle and more constrained by reason than some believers want to admit. And the stone paradox persists, waiting in every discussion of omnipotence, ready to challenge every claim that God can do anything, pushing always toward qualification, toward clarification, toward the recognition that anything means anything logically possible, and that even divine power operates within the bounds of coherence. The raven paradox, another name for the same strange logic. The paradox stands at the intersection of logic and intuition, bearing multiple names but always presenting the same fundamental puzzle. And the raven paradox is simply another term for what Hempel called the paradox of confirmation, the same logical structure, the same counterintuitive conclusion that observing non-black non-ravens confirms the hypothesis that all ravens are black. And the paradox is named after ravens because this particular example, chosen somewhat arbitrarily, has become the standard formulation, the canonical case study in discussions of confirmation theory. And ravens serve as the perfect illustration, because the hypothesis all ravens are black is simple, clear, empirically testable, and the conclusion that red apples provide evidence for this hypothesis is maximally counterintuitive. And so the raven paradox persists as a permanent fixture in philosophy of science, a problem that every theory of confirmation must address, a test case that separates adequate theories from inadequate ones. The paradox reveals something deep about the nature of scientific reasoning, about how we move from observations to generalizations, from data to theories, and the lesson is that confirmation cannot be understood purely formally, cannot be reduced to logical rules applied mechanically, but requires judgment, requires taking into account background knowledge, context, relevance, and the structure of inquiry, and different philosophical traditions respond differently. Bayesians appeal to prior probabilities and degrees of belief. Falsificationists focus on potential refutation rather than positive confirmation, and pragmatists emphasize the goals and methods of actual scientific practice, and each approach offers tools for handling the paradox, for explaining why ravens matter and apples do not despite the logical equivalence. And the paradox serves as a crucible, a test that theories of confirmation must pass. And many theories that seem plausible initially reveal inadequacies when confronted with the raven paradox, fail to explain our intuitions, force counterintuitive conclusions, or require abandoning principles that seem essential to scientific reasoning. Visualize a scientist designing an experiment to test whether all ravens are black, and the scientist must decide what to observe, where to look, what data to collect, and the obvious choice is to find ravens and check their colour, to go where ravens live and observe them systematically. And no scientist would waste time observing apples or examining non-ravens, not because such observations are irrelevant in principle, but because they are inefficient, provide so little information relative to the effort required that they're not worth doing. And this practical irrelevance, this decision based on efficiency rather than logic, is what our intuitions track. And the paradox arises from confusing practical irrelevance with logical irrelevance, from thinking that because we should not observe apples in practice, apples must not provide confirmation in principle. And once we separate these two senses of relevance, the paradox loses some of its force, becomes less paradoxical, becomes a lesson about the difference between what logically confirms a hypothesis and what constitutes good scientific practice. The raven paradox also illustrates the problem of GRU, the challenge of projectable predicates, because just as we face questions about what confirms hypotheses, we also face questions about which generalizations are legitimate, which patterns can be projected into the future. And these two problems are connected. Both involve understanding how observation relates to theory, how particular instances support general claims. And the raven paradox is one manifestation of the broader problem of induction, the problem of justifying our inferences from observed to unobserved cases. And solving the raven paradox completely would require solving the problem of induction, would require explaining how evidence works, how observation justifies belief. And this larger project remains incomplete, remains one of philosophy's central unsolved problems. The paradox endures because it is simple, because it uses everyday examples that everyone understands, ravens and apples and colours, and yet produces a conclusion that seems absurd, that violates common sense, and this combination makes it pedagogically powerful, makes it an excellent tool for teaching about confirmation and scientific method, for showing students that logic can lead to surprising places, that formal reasoning sometimes conflicts with intuition, and that philosophy of science is not obvious, not a matter of codifying what scientists already know, but involves genuine puzzles that require careful analysis to resolve. And the raven paradox remains a standard topic in introductory courses, a problem that every student of philosophy of science encounters. And despite decades of discussion, despite hundreds of papers and books addressing it, the paradox retains its power to surprise, to challenge, to force recognition that confirmation is more subtle than it appears. The ravens fly, black against the sky, and somewhere a scientist notes another black raven, records it as confirming evidence, and elsewhere someone observes a red apple, and logic says this too is evidence about ravens. This too confirms the hypothesis, and the paradox persists, a challenge to our understanding of how evidence works. A puzzle that remains unsolved, not because no solutions have been proposed, but because every solution requires sacrificing some intuition, requires accepting some counterintuitive conclusion, or rejecting some seemingly obvious principle. And the paradox stands as a reminder that scientific method is not straightforward, that the relationship between theory and observation is complex, and that even basic questions about confirmation, about what counts as evidence, about how we learn from experience, remain philosophically problematic, and the raven paradox endures. The ship of Theseus. A ship returns to harbour after a long voyage, its wooden planks weathered and damaged by storms and salt. And the repairs begin. One plank is removed and replaced with new wood, then another, and over months or years every single plank, every beam, every nail is replaced until nothing of the original materials remains. And yet it is still called the ship of Theseus, still registered under the same name, still captained by the same crew, and the question arises, is it the same ship or a different ship? And if it is different, when did it become different? After the first plank was replaced, or the 10th, or the last, and where is the boundary between identity and change? The paradox is ancient, discussed by Greek and Roman philosophers, and it strikes at the heart of what it means for an object to persist through time, to remain itself despite losing and gaining parts. And the problem deepens when a second scenario is introduced. Imagine that all the original planks removed from the ship of Theseus are collected and stored, and then using only those original materials, a second ship is built, an exact replica assembled from the very wood that once formed the ship of Theseus. And now there are two ships, one that has been continuously repaired and one that is made entirely of the original materials. And which one is the true ship of Theseus, the one with continuity of form and function, or the one with continuity of material? The paradox has no clear answer, and different philosophical traditions offer different responses. Some argue that identity is determined by material composition, that an object is the sum of its parts, and so the ship made from original planks is the true ship of Theseus, even though it was disassembled and reassembled, while others argue that identity is determined by form and function, that what makes the ship is its structure and purpose, and so the continuously repaired ship retains its identity, even though none of its original material remains. Still others suggest that identity is conventional, a matter of social agreement and practical convenience, that there is no objective fact about which ship is the real ship of Theseus, only a question of what we choose to call it based on our needs and conventions. The paradox extends beyond ships to living organisms because the cells in the human body are constantly dying and being replaced, and over a period of years almost every atom in the body is exchanged with the environment, and yet a person is considered the same person throughout their life. And so what makes identity persist? Is it continuity of consciousness, continuity of memory, continuity of physical form, or something else entirely? The problem also appears in legal and ethical contexts, questions about personal responsibility over time, whether a person who has changed dramatically is still accountable for actions committed decades earlier, whether a corporation that has replaced all its employees and assets is still the same entity bound by old contracts, whether a nation that has undergone revolution and transformation retains the obligations of its former government. Some philosophers embrace a four-dimensionalist view, arguing that objects are not three-dimensional things that persist through time, but four-dimensional space-time worms, extended through time as well as space, and that what we call the ship of Theseus is really a temporally extended object, a continuous path through space-time, and the question of identity becomes a question of how we slice that four-dimensional object into temporal parts. Others reject this view, insisting that objects exist wholly at each moment, that the ship of Theseus at one time is numerically identical to the ship of Theseus at another time, if there is the right kind of continuity between them, though what counts as the right kind of continuity remains disputed. The ship of Theseus paradox remains unsolved, a puzzle that philosophy has examined for over 2 millennia without reaching consensus, and it stands as a reminder that identity, persistence, and change are not as straightforward as they seem, that the question of what makes something the same thing over time is one of the deepest and most difficult in metaphysics, and that the world we navigate, full of objects and people and institutions that seem to endure, may be far more fluid and ambiguous than common sense suggests. The sleeping beauty problem. A woman volunteers for an unusual experiment in probability and subjective credence, an experiment that will test how she should reason about her own situation when her memory has been manipulated. And the setup is as follows. On Sunday she's put to sleep, and a fair coin is flipped. If the coin lands heads, she is awakened on Monday, interviewed briefly, and then the experiment ends. But if the coin lands tails, she is awakened on Monday, interviewed, given a drug that erases her memory of the Monday awakening, put back to sleep, awakened again on Tuesday, interviewed again, and then the experiment ends. And the crucial feature is that whenever she is awakened, she cannot tell whether it is Monday or Tuesday, cannot tell whether the coin landed heads or tails. She knows only that she is awake and being interviewed. And the question posed to philosophers and decision theorists is this: when Sleeping Beauty is awakened and interviewed, what should her credence be that the coin landed heads? What probability should she assign to heads given her situation and her knowledge? The problem divides respondents into two camps, the halfers and the thirders, and each position has compelling arguments. Yet they reach opposite conclusions, creating a paradox that reveals deep tensions in how we think about probability, information, and self-locating belief. The halfers argue that Sleeping Beauty should maintain her prior credence of one half, because the coin is fair and nothing she learns upon awakening provides evidence about how it landed. She knew before the experiment that she would be awakened at least once, and being awakened is guaranteed regardless of the coin outcome, and so the awakening provides no new information, no reason to update her probability, and therefore she should stick with one half. And this reasoning seems straightforward, seems to respect the principle that probabilities should only change when new evidence is acquired, and being awakened is not new evidence because it was certain to happen. The thirders argue that Sleeping Beauty should assign credence 1/3 to heads, because there are 3 possible awakening situations: heads Monday, tails Monday, and tails Tuesday. And from her perspective, upon awakening, these 3 situations are indistinguishable. She cannot tell which one she is in, and by a principle of indifference among indistinguishable possibilities, she should assign equal probability to each, 1/3 to each. And since heads corresponds to only one of these situations, heads Monday, while tails corresponds to 2, tails Monday, and tails Tuesday, her credence in heads should be 1/3, and her credence in tails should be 2/3. And this reasoning seems to respect the information that if the coin landed tails, she is twice as likely to be awakened, that her current awakening is more probable under tails than under heads. And this should shift her credence toward tails. The disagreement between halfers and thirders reflects a deeper question about what credences represent and how they should be updated, Hulfers tend to interpret credence as tracking objective chance, the physical probability of the coin flip, which is 1/2 and does not change based on Sleeping Beauty's subjective situation, while thirders interpret credence as tracking epistemic probability, the rational degree of belief given all available information, including self-locating information. And from this perspective, Sleeping Beauty's situation upon awakening is evidence that favours Tails, because Tails generates more awakenings and therefore more situations in which she finds herself awakened and uncertain. The problem becomes more vivid when decision-theoretic stakes are introduced. Suppose Sleeping Beauty is offered a bet each time she is awakened, a bet that pays if heads and costs if tails, and she must decide whether to accept. And now the question is what odds she should demand to make the bet fair, and Halfers say she should demand even odds, 1-to-1, because the coin is fair, while thirders say she should demand 2-to-1 odds in favour of tails, because she is more likely to be betting in a tails scenario where she will lose. And when the bet is actually offered and payoffs are calculated, the thirder strategy performs better, winning more money on average. And this seems to vindicate the thirder position, to show that 1/3 is the correct credence for guiding decisions. Yet Hulfers respond that this merely shows a difference between epistemic credence and decision-making strategy, that the correct probability of heads is still 1/2, even if the correct betting strategy involves different odds. The Sleeping Beauty problem also raises questions about the reference class problem, the question of which group of situations Sleeping Beauty should consider herself a random member of. Should she think of herself as randomly selected from the set of coin flips, in which case heads and tails are equally likely, or should she think of herself as randomly selected from the set of awakening events, in which case tails is twice as likely, and different reference classes lead to different probabilities, and there is no obviously correct way to choose between them. The problem connects to issues about personal identity and indexical information, information about who or when or where you are, because Sleeping Beauty, upon awakening, does not learn any new didicto information, any new information about how the world is. She already knew that she would be awakened at least once, but she does gain new desi information, new information about which temporal slice of herself she currently is, new information about her location in time, and the question is whether this indexical information should change her credences, whether learning that you're currently experiencing an awakening provides evidence about the coin, even if you knew that you would experience at least one awakening. Some philosophers propose middle positions, arguing that different notions of probability are at play, and that the Halfa and thirder answers are both correct relative to different interpretive frameworks, or that the question is underspecified and cannot be answered without further stipulations about what is being asked. But these conciliatory approaches satisfy neither Halfers nor thirders, each of whom believes their answer is the uniquely correct one. The problem has spawned an enormous literature, with variants and extensions testing different aspects of the puzzle, versions with different probabilities for the coin, versions with different numbers of awakenings, versions where Sleeping Beauty is told what day it is, and each variant sharpens the intuitions or reveals new complications, and the debate shows no signs of resolution. Conferences are held, papers are written, arguments are refined, and the community remains divided. And this persistence suggests that the Sleeping Beauty problem may not have a single correct answer, may instead reveal an ambiguity or indeterminacy in the concept of rational credence, a place where our intuitions pull in different directions, and no amount of formalization fully captures what is at stake. Sleeping Beauty lies in the laboratory, awakened and interviewed, uncertain whether it is Monday or Tuesday, uncertain whether the coin landed heads or tails, and she must assign a probability, must decide what to believe. And the philosophers watching cannot agree on what she should say, cannot agree on whether her credence should be one half or one third, and the experiment continues. The coin is flipped again and again. Sleeping Beauty is awakened and interviewed again and again, and the paradox persists, a puzzle that seems simple, a question about a coin flip and some awakenings, yet contains within it deep disagreements about probability, evidence, identity, and the nature of rational belief. And no solution has won consensus, no argument has settled the debate, and Sleeping Beauty remains caught between halfers and thirders, between two ways of understanding her situation, two ways of reasoning about uncertainty, and perhaps there is no fact of the matter, no correct answer, only different frameworks that give different results. And the choice between them reflects philosophical commitments rather than mathematical necessity, and the problem endures, a touchstone in debates about probability, a puzzle that refuses to be solved, a question that generates endless discussion, yet no agreement, and Sleeping Beauty wakes and wonders, and assigns her credence, and the debate continues, without end, without resolution, a permanent fixture in the landscape of philosophical paradoxes. The skeptical paradox. The ancient skeptics posed a question that has haunted philosophy ever since. How can we know anything at all? How can we justify our beliefs about the external world when those beliefs rest on foundations that are themselves uncertain, when every justification requires further justification in an endless regress? And this is the skeptical paradox, the problem that knowledge seems both necessary for action and impossible to achieve, that we cannot help but believe and claim to know, yet we cannot provide the kind of justification that would ground those claims in certainty. The skeptical argument takes many forms. One of the most powerful begins with the observation that our beliefs about the external world are based on sensory experience. We believe there is a table in front of us because we see it and touch it. But sensory experience can be misleading. Illusions and hallucinations occur. Dreams feel real while we are dreaming them. And so the mere fact that we have a certain experience does not guarantee that the world is as the experience represents it. And this means that our sensory experiences underdetermine our beliefs about the world. The same experiences could be produced by a real table, by a hallucination, by a detailed dream, or by a Cartesian demon systematically deceiving us. And if we cannot rule out these skeptical scenarios, then we cannot know that the table is real, and this reasoning applies to all our beliefs about the external world. None of them are certain. All are vulnerable to skeptical doubt. The skeptic does not claim to know that we are deceived, only that we cannot know we are not deceived. And this is enough to undermine knowledge, because knowledge seems to require not just true belief, but justified true belief. And justification seems to require being able to rule out relevant alternatives. And the skeptical scenarios are relevant alternatives that we cannot rule out, at least not without begging the question, not without assuming the very thing we are trying to prove, that our senses are reliable, that the external world exists, that we are not dreaming or deceived. The skeptical paradox is that we seem to have two incompatible intuitions. On the one hand, we are convinced that we know many things, that we know there is a table in front of us, that we know we have hands, that we know the earth is round, and these beliefs seem as certain as anything could be. And on the other hand, we find the skeptical arguments compelling. We recognize that we cannot prove we are not deceived, that the possibility of systematic error cannot be ruled out by any non-circular reasoning. And so, we oscillate between certainty and doubt, between the conviction that skepticism is absurd and the recognition that we cannot refute it. Descartes attempted to escape skepticism through his method of doubt, doubting everything that could be doubted until he reached the indubitable foundation, cogito ergo sum. I think therefore I am, the one truth that even the most radical skepticism cannot undermine, because to doubt that one exists is to presuppose that there is someone doing the doubting. And from this foundation, Descartes tried to rebuild knowledge, proving the existence of God and using God's benevolence to guarantee the reliability of clear and distinct perceptions. But few philosophers have found this reconstruction convincing. The arguments for God's existence are controversial, and even if successful, they would not close the gap between subjective certainty and objective truth, between what seems clear and what actually is. Hume took skepticism more seriously, arguing that we have no rational justification for believing in causation, induction, or the existence of an external world, that these beliefs are products of custom and habit rather than reason, that we believe because we cannot help but believe, because our psychology compels us, not because we have good arguments. And Hume distinguished between philosophical skepticism, the theoretical position that knowledge is impossible, and practical certainty, the psychological inevitability of belief and action. And he suggested that we can acknowledge the force of skeptical arguments in the study while setting them aside in ordinary life. Though this division between theory and practice remains uncomfortable, a kind of intellectual schizophrenia where we admit that our beliefs are unjustified, yet continue to hold them anyway. Kant responded to Hume by arguing that skepticism rests on a mistake, the assumption that knowledge requires correspondence between our representations and things as they are in themselves, independent of our cognitive faculties, and Kant argued that this assumption is incoherent, that we can only know things as they appear to us, as structured by the forms of intuition and the categories of understanding, and that the question of how things are independently of these structures is meaningless, not answerable even in principle, and so skepticism about the external world is based on a confused demand, a demand for a kind of knowledge that is conceptually impossible, and Kant's transcendental idealism attempts to secure the objectivity of knowledge by relativizing it to the conditions of possible experience, making knowledge possible by making it more modest, more limited, no longer claiming to grasp things in themselves, but only things as they appear within the framework of human cognition. Contemporary epistemology has developed various responses to skepticism. Externalist theories argue that knowledge does not require the ability to rule out all skeptical scenarios, that knowledge requires only that beliefs be produced by reliable processes or track the truth in certain ways. And on these views we can know we have hands, even if we cannot prove we are not brains in vats. Because in the actual world, our perceptual beliefs are reliably formed, and the fact that we cannot distinguish the actual world from a skeptical scenario does not undermine knowledge as long as we are in fact in the actual world, and our beliefs are in fact reliably formed. Contextualist theories argue that the standards for knowledge vary with context, that in ordinary contexts, skeptical scenarios are not relevant, and we can truly claim to know many things, while in philosophical contexts where skeptical scenarios are explicitly raised, the standards become more demanding and knowledge claims become false. And this allows us to preserve both the intuition that we know many things in everyday life, and the intuition that skeptical arguments are powerful in philosophical inquiry, by treating these as claims about knowledge in different contexts with different standards. The skeptical paradox remains unresolved. No consensus has emerged about how to respond to skeptical arguments, and different philosophers find different responses more or less satisfying depending on their broader commitments about the nature of knowledge, justification, and the mind's relationship to the world. And the paradox continues to drive epistemological theorizing, forcing philosophers to clarify what they mean by knowledge, what conditions must be met for a belief to count as knowledge, and whether the concept of knowledge we ordinarily employ is coherent or whether it contains internal tensions that cannot be fully resolved. The skeptic sits in doubt, questioning everything, unable to claim knowledge, yet unable to stop believing, and the rest of us navigates between confidence and uncertainty, acting as if we know, while acknowledging in quieter moments that our knowledge rests on foundations that are less secure than we would like, that the gap between appearance and reality cannot be fully closed, that the possibility of error cannot be eliminated, and that knowledge, if it exists at all, is more fragile and more difficult to achieve than common sense suggests. And the paradox endures, the ancient puzzle that will not die, the question that philosophy cannot answer but cannot stop asking, and we continue to believe, to claim to know, to act with confidence, while the skeptic watches and waits, reminding us that certainty is elusive, that doubt is always possible, that the foundations of knowledge are shakier than they appear. The split brain paradox. When one person becomes two, a patient suffers from severe epilepsy, seizures that cannot be controlled by medication, seizures that spread across the brain causing disability and danger. And as a last resort, surgeons perform a procedure called corpus callosotomy, severing the corpus callosum, the massive bundle of nerve fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And this procedure prevents seizures from spreading, confines them to one hemisphere, and after surgery the patient seems normal, speaks and acts as before, personality intact, memories preserved, and casual observation reveals no deficit. But careful testing reveals something extraordinary, something deeply strange. The two hemispheres have been separated, are processing information independently, are operating as two separate cognitive systems. And in certain experimental conditions, the hemispheres appear to have different perceptions, different knowledge, different intentions, and the patient, who was one person with one unified consciousness, before surgery now seems to be two persons, two separate centers of awareness inhabiting a single body, and this is the split brain paradox, a puzzle about personal identity, about the unity of consciousness, about whether consciousness is divisible, and about what counts as a person, and the phenomenon, discovered and studied extensively by Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga, challenges our assumptions about the self, about the unity of the mind, and about whether consciousness is necessarily singular or could be plural within a single brain. Imagine the split brain setup. The patient sits before a screen and images are flashed briefly to either the left or right visual field, and because of how vision is organized, the left visual field projects to the right hemisphere and the right visual field to the left hemisphere. And normally, the hemispheres communicate through the corpus callosum, sharing information. But in split brain patients, this communication is severed, and information presented to one hemisphere is not available to the other, and the left hemisphere, which controls language, can report what it sees, but the right hemisphere, which typically lacks language, cannot speak. And this creates dissociations, cases where the person can verbally report seeing something flash to the right visual field, processed by the left hemisphere, but denies seeing anything flash to the left visual field, processed by the right hemisphere, and yet the right hemisphere clearly saw the stimulus, because when asked to point with the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, the patient points accurately, and so the patient both saw and did not see, both knows and does not know, depending on which hemisphere is asked. And the unity of consciousness seems to break down, seems to split into two separate streams. The paradox becomes even more dramatic in cases of conflicting intentions, where experimenters present different instructions to each hemisphere, and the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, performs one action while the right hand, controlled by the left hemisphere, performs another, and sometimes the hands conflict. One hand buttoning a shirt while the other unbuttons it, one hand reaching for an object while the other pushes it away, and the patient reports frustration, reports feeling as if the left hand has a mind of its own, is acting independently, and the verbal left hemisphere confabulates explanations, invents reasons for the left hand's actions, reasons that are false because the left hemisphere does not know what the right hemisphere is doing, does not have access to its intentions. And these cases suggest that split brain patients are not one person, but two persons. Two separate conscious agents inhabiting one body, each with their own perceptions, their own knowledge, their own goals, and the philosophical question is whether this is correct, whether splitting the brain splits the person, whether consciousness is divisible, whether personal identity can survive such division. Visualize consciousness before and after the surgery. Before surgery, there is one unified consciousness, one stream of awareness, experiences from both hemispheres integrated, and after surgery, this unity is broken. Each hemisphere processes information separately, and the question is whether there are now two consciousnesses, two subjects of experience, or whether there is still one consciousness that has become disconnected from some information, and different philosophers give different answers. Some argue that split brain patients become two persons, that severing the corpus callosum creates two centers of consciousness where there was one, and others argue that the patient remains one person, but with a divided consciousness, a consciousness that is no longer unified. And still others argue that consciousness remains unified, but access to information is divided, and the hemispheres are like modules within one consciousness rather than separate consciousnesses. The split brain paradox raises questions about the relationship between unity and consciousness, about whether consciousness is essentially unified or whether it could be divided or plural. And normal consciousness feels unified, feels like there is one subject experiencing everything, one perspective from which the world is viewed, and split brain cases challenge this unity, suggest that consciousness could be less unified than it seems, could be divided into separate streams that normally communicate but could operate independently. And this has implications for understanding the self, for whether the self is a unified entity or a collection of parts, for whether personal identity requires unity of consciousness or could survive division. One response to the paradox denies that split brain patients become two persons, argues that the left hemisphere, the language-dominant hemisphere, is the person, is the locus of consciousness and self-awareness, and the right hemisphere, while capable of processing information and guiding behavior, lacks the higher-order thought and self-awareness that constitute personhood. And so the patient remains one person, the left hemisphere person, and the right hemisphere is more like an unconscious module that influences behavior without being a separate conscious agent. And this response preserves the singularity of persons, but at the cost of denying consciousness to the right hemisphere. Another response accepts that split brain patients become two persons, accepts that there are two centers of consciousness after surgery, two subjects of experience, and argues that personal identity is not preserved through brain bisection, that splitting the brain creates two persons from one, and these two persons share a body, share a past, but are distinct in the present, have different experiences, different knowledge. And this response takes the split brain evidence seriously, treats the hemispheres as separate conscious systems, but faces the challenge of explaining how two persons can inhabit one body, how they coordinate, and whether one has priority over the other. A third response appeals to degrees of unity, argues that consciousness is not all or nothing unified, but comes in degrees, and split brain patients have less unified consciousness than normal people, but are not completely divided, are somewhere between one person and two, and unity of consciousness is a spectrum, and split brain patients are toward the divided end. And this response avoids the binary choice between one person and two, allows for partial division, for consciousness that is neither fully unified nor fully separate. And this seems to fit the evidence better, fits the fact that split brain patients seem mostly normal, seem like one person most of the time, but show signs of division in specific experimental conditions. The split brain paradox also connects to debates about personal identity over time, about what makes you the same person you were yesterday, about whether personal identity requires psychological continuity, and split brain cases are like thought experiments about fission made real, are actual cases where one person seems to become two, and philosophers have long debated fission cases, cases where a person's brain is divided and placed in two bodies, and asked whether the original person survives, and if so, which resulting person is the original. And split brain surgery is a partial realization of this scenario, does not create two separate bodies, but does create two separate information processing systems, and the philosophical puzzles about fission apply to split brain cases, puzzles about identity, about survival, about what matters in personal existence. The patient lives with split brain, navigates the world, seems normal to observers, and most of the time, the two hemispheres cooperate through shared subcortical structures, through behavioral coordination, through learned patterns, and the division is not apparent. But in the laboratory, under controlled conditions, the split emerges. The two hemispheres reveal their independence, and the paradox appears: one person or two, unified or divided, single consciousness or dual, and the answer remains disputed, remains unclear, and the split brain paradox endures as one of the most fascinating and philosophically significant phenomena in neuroscience, a real-world case that challenges our understanding of consciousness, of unity, of personal identity, and of what it means to be one person rather than many. And the severed corpus callosum sits there, two hemispheres separated, and the question persists: is this one mind or two? And the paradox remains unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, a permanent puzzle about the nature of self and consciousness. The problem of universals, why redness exists everywhere and nowhere. A philosopher observes that multiple objects share properties. Multiple things are red, multiple objects are round, multiple animals are cats, and this sharing, this commonality, requires explanation, requires understanding what it is for different things to have the same property. And this is the problem of universals, one of the oldest and most fundamental problems in metaphysics. The question of whether properties like redness or roundness or cathood are real entities that exist independently of particular objects, are universals that multiple particulars instantiate, or whether properties are merely names, merely words we use to group similar objects without corresponding to any real shared entity. And the problem divides philosophers into realists who accept that universals exist and nominalists who deny them, and both positions face difficulties. Both must explain how we think and talk about properties, how science discovers laws about kinds, how resemblance works, and neither position has one consensus. And the problem of universals remains one of the deepest questions in ontology, a question about the fundamental furniture of reality, about what kinds of things exist. Imagine two red objects, a red ball and a red shirt, and they share something, they are both red, and the question is what this sharing amounts to, what grounds the similarity. And the realist says both objects instantiate the same universal, the property redness, which exists as a separate entity, an abstract object that is somehow present in both particulars. And the universal redness is one thing that exists in multiple places, is wholly present in each red object. And this explains similarity, explains how multiple things can be red. They all instantiate the same universal, and the nominalist says there is no universal. There are only the particular red objects, and the similarity is primitive, is a brute fact, or is explained by resemblance. The objects resemble each other, or is explained by linguistic convention. We call both red using the same word, and redness is not a real entity, but is a feature of our language or conceptual scheme. The problem can be stated as a dilemma. Either properties are universals, abstract entities that exist independently of particulars, or properties are just features of particulars. And if properties are universals, then we face the problem of how abstract entities relate to concrete particulars, how universals are present in objects, whether they exist in Plato's realm of forms separate from physical reality, or exist in objects themselves, as Aristotle thought. And if properties are just features of particulars, then we face the problem of explaining resemblance, explaining what makes multiple objects similar, what grounds classification into kinds, and neither horn is comfortable. Neither provides an obvious easy answer, and the problem of universals forces us to choose between problematic metaphysics or problematic nominalism. Visualize the realist picture, a realm of abstract universals, redness, roundness, cathood, existing eternally and independently, and particular objects participating in these universals, instantiating them, exemplifying them, and an object is read by standing in an instantiation relation to the universal redness. And this relation is mysterious, is not itself explained. How do abstract universals connect to concrete particulars? How does the abstract realm interact with the physical realm? And the realist must either accept this as primitive, as an unexplained connection, or provide a theory of instantiation. And various theories have been proposed, but all face difficulties. All struggle to explain how universals and particulars relate. One version of realism, Platonic realism, says universals exist in a separate realm, a realm of forms, and particulars participate in forms, and the perfect circle exists in the realm of forms, and physical circles approximate it, participate in it imperfectly, and this explains how we can think about perfect circles. Even though no physical object is perfectly circular, we grasp the form directly through reason, but the theory faces the problem of how we access the realm of forms, how our minds, which are physical, can connect to abstract entities, and the theory faces the problem of how participation works, how forms relate to particulars. And Aristotle rejected Platonic realism, argued that forms exist in particulars, are immanent in objects, not transcendent, and redness exists in red objects, is a component of them, and this avoids the separate realm, but creates other problems. How can one form be in many places? How can universals be divided among particulars? Nominalism rejects universals entirely, accepts only particulars, and explains similarity without appealing to shared properties. And various nominalist strategies exist. Resemblance nominalism says objects are similar because they resemble each other, and resemblance is primitive, not explained by shared properties. And redness is just the class of objects that resemble paradigm red objects. And this avoids commitment to universals but faces the problem that resemblance seems to presuppose properties, seems to require that objects share something. And if resemblance is primitive, then we have not really eliminated properties but renamed them. And resemblance nominalism faces technical difficulties with explaining degrees of resemblance, with avoiding circularity. Another nominalist approach, predicate nominalism, says properties are just predicates, just words, and redness is the predicate red, and objects are read by satisfying the predicate. And this linguistic nominalism faces the problem of explaining why predicates apply. What makes it true that an object satisfies red? And the answer seems to require properties after all, seems to presuppose that objects have features that make predicates apply, and so predicate nominalism seems to presuppose what it denies, seems to need properties to explain predication. A third nominalist approach, trope theory, accepts that properties exist but denies that they are universals, argues that properties are particulars, are individual instances, and each red object has its own individual redness, its own red trope, and tropes resemble each other. Explains similarity, and universals are eliminated, replaced by classes of resembling tropes, and this approach preserves some realist insights, accepts that properties are real, while avoiding commitment to abstract universals, and trope theory has been developed extensively, has become a major alternative to both traditional realism and nominalism, and provides a middle ground that many find attractive. The problem of universals also affects science, affects understanding what scientific laws are, because laws concern kinds, concern all electrons or all mammals, and laws seem to involve universals, seem to say that all objects instantiating a certain universal behave in certain ways, and if universals do not exist, then what are laws about? Are they merely regularities in particular objects? Are they conventions of our theorizing? And nominalists must explain how science discovers objective laws if kinds are not real, if universals do not exist. And this challenge drives some philosophers toward realism, toward accepting that kinds are real, that universals exist because science seems to require them. The red ball and red shirt share something or do not share anything, are similar by instantiating a universal or by resembling each other. And the problem of universals asks which, asks what properties are, whether they are real entities or linguistic conveniences, whether redness exists in Plato's heaven or in particular red things or only in our conceptual scheme. And the answers divide philosophers, have divided them for millennia. And the problem remains unsolved, remains central to metaphysics, and redness exists everywhere in all red things. If realism is true, and nowhere if nominalism is true, and the problem persists, ancient and unresolved, a permanent fixture in ontology, a question about whether reality contains abstract repeatable entities, or only concrete unrepeatable particulars, and the universals wait, existing or not existing, and the problem endures. The problem of other minds, how you know anyone else, is conscious. You observe a person crying, tears streaming down their face, and you infer that they are sad, that they are experiencing the subjective feeling of sadness, the inner emotional state. And this inference seems natural, seems obvious, but philosopher Bertrand Russell asks what justifies it. What evidence proves that other people have minds, have consciousness, have inner experiences like yours? And the evidence is purely behavioural. You see the tears, hear the words, observe the actions, but you never directly experience another person's consciousness, never feel their pain or see their thoughts. And so the inference from behaviour to consciousness is not logically certain, cannot be proven beyond doubt. And it is logically possible, conceivably, though perhaps not believably, that other people are unconscious automata, zombies who behave as if conscious but have no inner life. And this possibility, however remote, reveals that our knowledge of other minds is inferential, is based on analogy to our own case. And this is the problem of other minds. The epistemological challenge of justifying our belief that other people are conscious, that they have subjective experiences, that they are not merely sophisticated mechanisms producing behaviour without accompanying phenomenology. Imagine trying to prove that someone else has consciousness, trying to establish with certainty that they have subjective experiences, and you observe their behaviour, see them wince in pain, hear them describe their feelings, watch them respond appropriately to stimuli, and all this behaviour is consistent with consciousness, is what we expect conscious beings to do, but it is also consistent with unconsciousness, with sophisticated programming that produces appropriate responses without any inner experience, and there is no test, no observation, no experiment that directly reveals consciousness, that proves beyond doubt that someone else has subjective experiences, and so the inference to other minds is always uncertain, is always vulnerable to skeptical doubt. And while we do not actually doubt that other people are conscious, while the skeptical scenario seems absurd, the philosophical point is that our belief cannot be proven, cannot be established with the certainty we might desire. The problem of other minds rests on the asymmetry between first-person and third-person access to mental states. You have direct access to your own consciousness, immediate awareness of your own thoughts and feelings, but you have only indirect access to others' consciousness, can only infer it from their behaviour and their reports. And this asymmetry creates an epistemological gap, a gap between what you can know with certainty about yourself and what you can know about others, and crossing this gap requires inference, requires reasoning from observed behaviour to unobserved mental states. And such inference is never certain, always vulnerable to error. The traditional solution to the problem of other minds is the argument from analogy, which says that I observe a correlation in my own case between mental states and behaviour. I know that when I am in pain, I exhibit certain behaviours. When I am sad, I cry, and so on. and I observe that other humans exhibit the same behaviors, and by analogy, I infer that they have the same mental states, that when they exhibit pain behavior, they are in pain. And this analogy is strengthened by the similarity between my body and their bodies, by the fact that we share similar physiology, and so it is reasonable to infer that we share similar mental lives. But critics of the argument from analogy point out that it is based on a sample size of one. On my own case, and generalizing from one case to all cases is weak induction. And moreover, the analogy assumes what it sets out to prove, assumes that behavioral similarity indicates mental similarity, and this assumption is precisely what the skeptic challenges. Visualize the epistemic situation. You are confined to your own consciousness, your own first-person perspective, and everyone else exists outside this perspective, exists as objects in your experience rather than as subjects with their own experiences. And the question is how you know that these objects are also subjects, also have inner lives, and the answer cannot be certain, cannot be proven, can only be inferred with greater or lesser confidence. And this realization that our knowledge of other minds is uncertain is one of the permanent features of the human epistemic situation, a gap that cannot be fully closed. Another approach to the problem of other minds appeals to the best explanation, argues that the hypothesis that other people are conscious, that they have minds, is the best explanation of their behavior, that positing consciousness explains why people speak as they do, why they report experiences, why they act purposefully, and so on. And while the zombie hypothesis, the hypothesis that people lack consciousness, is logically possible, it is not plausible, not the best explanation, and so we are justified in believing that other people are conscious, even though we cannot prove it with certainty. And this response treats knowledge of other minds as a theoretical inference, as a hypothesis confirmed by evidence, rather than a conclusion proven with certainty. A third approach, associated with Wittgenstein, questions the framework of the problem, argues that the idea of privately checking whether another person is conscious is confused, that consciousness is not a hidden inner property that might be present or absent while behavior remains the same, but is manifested in behavior, is constituted by appropriate responsiveness, and there is no gap between behavior and mind, no possibility of zombie-like creatures that behave as if conscious but lack consciousness, because consciousness just is the pattern of appropriate behavior, and the problem of other minds dissolves, because it is based on a misunderstanding of what consciousness is, treats it as an inner object rather than as a pattern of life. The problem of other minds connects to debates about artificial intelligence, about whether machines could be conscious, because the same epistemic situation applies. We observe the behavior of AI systems, see them generate text, respond to questions, exhibit apparently intelligent behavior, and the question arises whether there is consciousness behind the behavior, whether the machine has subjective experiences, or whether it is merely processing symbols without understanding. And our inability to solve the problem of other minds for humans makes the question of machine consciousness even more difficult, even more uncertain, and we face the possibility that we may never know whether AI is conscious, may never be able to prove or disprove machine sentience. The problem also has practical implications for how we treat non-human animals, for whether they have consciousness, feel pain, deserve moral consideration, and our evidence is behavioral. We see animals exhibit pain behavior, avoid harm, seek pleasure, and we infer that they are conscious, that they have subjective experiences, but the inference is uncertain. Is more uncertain the more different the animal is from us, and the problem of other minds makes it difficult to establish definitively which animals are conscious, which can suffer, which deserve protection. You see the person crying, and you believe they are sad, and you comfort them, and the interaction proceeds as if their consciousness is real, as if their suffering matters. And practically, this is enough. Socially, this is how we function. But philosophically, the question remains, how do you know? How can you prove that they are not a sophisticated zombie, that there is really someone home behind the tears? And the answer is that you cannot prove it, can only infer it, can only trust in analogy and explanation, and the shared form of life that suggests consciousness is universal among humans. And the problem of other minds persists, not as a practical obstacle, but as a philosophical recognition of the limits of knowledge, the gap between self and other, between first-person certainty and third-person inference. And the problem endures as a permanent feature of epistemology, a reminder that some things cannot be known with certainty, that consciousness is private, that the inner life of another remains always partially hidden, always known only through the indirect evidence of behaviour and report. And the crying continues, and the inference to sadness continues, and life proceeds, and the problem remains, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, a gap that defines the epistemic situation of embodied minds, trying to know other embodied minds, and the question persists, how do you know anyone else is conscious? And the honest answer is, you do not know with certainty. You only believe with confidence but without proof. And this uncertainty is part of what it means to be human, to be a conscious being among what you believe are other conscious beings, but can never know for certain. The problem of the many. A cloud drifts across the sky, its edges soft and undefined, fading gradually into the surrounding air, and a question arises that seems absurd at first. How many clouds are there? Is it one cloud, or is it many? And the answer is not as obvious as it seems, because the boundary of a cloud is vague, imprecise, and this vagueness creates a puzzle known as the problem of the many, a paradox about identity and indeterminacy that challenges our assumptions about what it means to be a single object. Consider the cloud more carefully. There is no sharp line where the cloud ends and the clear air begins. Instead, there is a gradient of water droplet density, thicker in some regions and thinner in others. And so we could draw the boundary of the cloud in many slightly different ways, each including or excluding a few droplets at the edges. And each such boundary defines a distinct aggregate of water molecules, and each aggregate has an equal claim to being the cloud. None is more privileged than any other, and so instead of one cloud there are millions of overlapping cloud candidates, each differing by just a few molecules, and all of them present at the same time in the same region of space. The problem generalizes to nearly every ordinary object. A cat sitting on a mat consists of trillions of cells and molecules, and the boundary of the cat is not precise. A few skin cells flake off constantly, a few hairs are loose, and so there are countless cat candidates, each differing slightly in which particles they include, and all of them have an equal claim to being the cat. And yet we do not say there are millions of cats sitting on the mat. We say there is one cat, and this creates a tension between our linguistic and conceptual practices and the metaphysical reality that seems to support vast multiplicity where we perceive unity. The paradox was articulated clearly by Peter Unger in the 1980s, though the underlying issue has roots in ancient philosophy, and it forces a choice between several unappealing options. One option is to accept that there really are many overlapping objects where we ordinarily think there is one. Millions of clouds and cats and tables all occupying nearly the same space, differing only by a few particles at the margins. Another option is to deny that ordinary objects exist at all, arguing that only fundamental particles or fields are real, and that clouds and cats are mere conventional designations we impose on complex arrangements of matter. And a third option is to embrace vagueness in the world itself, arguing that there is no fact of the matter about exactly which particles compose the cat, that the cat is a vague object with indeterminate boundaries. Though this raises difficult questions about the metaphysics of vagueness and whether reality itself can be indeterminate, or whether indeterminacy exists only in language and thought. Some philosophers argue that identity is conventional, That which aggregates counts as the cloud or the cat is determined by our practical interests and linguistic conventions rather than by objective facts. That there is no deep truth about where the cloud ends, only a question of what it is useful or natural to call a cloud in various contexts. And this view dissolves the paradox by denying that there is a genuine metaphysical problem, replacing it with a pragmatic question about how we choose to describe the world. Others insist that the problem of the many reveals a real difficulty in our ontology, that the world does not come pre-divided into discrete objects, that individuation is imposed by minds rather than discovered in nature, and that the apparent distinctness and unity of ordinary things is an artifact of perception and cognition rather than a feature of reality itself. The problem also connects to issues in vagueness and the Stoics paradox, because if the boundaries of objects are vague, then questions like how many clouds are in the sky or how many hairs must a person lose to become bald have no determinate answers. And this suggests that much of our language is infected with indeterminacy, that most predicates do not have sharp extensions, and that the classical logical principle of bivalence, the idea that every statement is either true or false, may fail for a vast range of ordinary claims. The problem of the many lingers as a reminder that the world of discrete objects we navigate daily, a world of cats and clouds and people, may be a useful fiction, a conceptual overlay we impose on a reality that is far more fluid and indeterminate than it appears, and that the question of how many things there are may have no answer, or infinitely many answers, or no meaning at all depending on how we choose to carve up the continuous flux of matter and energy into countable, nameable entities. The Stoics paradox: a single grain of sand is not a heap, this much seems certain, and adding one grain of sand to something that is not a heap does not suddenly create a heap. One grain cannot make that much difference, and yet if you continue adding grains one by one, at some point you will have a heap, perhaps after 1,000 grains, perhaps 10,000, but surely 1,000,000 grains of sand piled together constitute a heap. And so somewhere in the process of adding individual grains, a heap must have come into existence, but where, after which grain? And this is the Stoics paradox, named from the Greek word for heap, a puzzle about vague predicates and the boundaries of concepts that has troubled philosophers since ancient times. The paradox can be constructed for almost any vague term. A man with a full head of hair is not bald, and removing one hair does not make a bald man. One hair cannot be the difference between bald and not bald, and yet removing hairs one by one will eventually result in baldness. Or consider a tall person. If someone is tall, then removing 1 millimeter from their height does not make them not tall. 1 millimeter is imperceptible, insignificant, and yet removing millimeters one by one will eventually result in someone who is clearly not tall. And the same pattern applies to colours, to wealth, to age, to nearly every predicate we use in ordinary language. And in each case we are forced to accept either that there is a sharp boundary, a precise number of grains or hairs or millimeters that marks the transition, which seems arbitrary and implausible, or that there is no boundary at all, which leads to the absurd conclusion that no amount of sand is a heap, no person is bald, no one is tall, because the reasoning that prevents one grain from making a difference applies equally to every grain. The paradox exposes the vagueness inherent in natural language, the fact that most of our concepts do not have sharp boundaries, but instead fade gradually from clear cases to borderline cases to clear non-cases, and this vagueness creates logical problems, because classical logic assumes that every statement is either true or false, that predicates have determinate extensions, that there is a fact of the matter about whether any given collection of sand grains is a heap, but vague predicates resist this bivalent structure, and the Stoics paradox forces us to choose between preserving classical logic and accepting sharp boundaries, or rejecting classical logic and developing new logical systems that can handle vagueness. Some philosophers bite the bullet and accept that vague predicates have sharp boundaries, that there is a precise number of hairs that separates bald from not bald, even though we do not and perhaps cannot know what that number is. And they argue that this is no more mysterious than other forms of ignorance. That epistemicism, the view that vagueness is ignorance of sharp boundaries, preserves classical logic at the cost of accepting counterintuitive, hidden thresholds. Others reject sharp boundaries and embrace many-valued logic or fuzzy logic, systems where statements can be partially true, where being a heap admits of degrees, where a collection of grains can be somewhat a heap, more of a heap than another collection, but less of a heap than a third, and truth values range continuously from 0 to 1, rather than being restricted to true and false. Still others argue that vague predicates are context-sensitive, that what counts as a heap depends on the purposes and standards operative in a given context. That in some contexts a small pile might count as a heap, while in others only a large pile would. And so there is no absolute fact about heaphood, only relative facts indexed to contexts. The Sorites paradox also has practical implications. In law, where vague terms like reasonable or substantial must be applied to real cases. In medicine, where diagnoses depend on thresholds that are often vague. In ethics, where drawing lines between permissible and impermissible actions may require arbitrary boundaries that the Sorites' reasoning undermines. And in these domains, the paradox is not merely an abstract puzzle, but a genuine challenge to decision-making and judgment. The paradox remains unresolved. Philosophers continue to debate the best response, and it stands as a reminder that the concepts we use to navigate the world, the words we rely on to describe and categorize, are far less precise than we ordinarily assume, that vagueness is pervasive, that boundaries are often illusory, and that the attempt to force the fluid and gradual into the rigid and discrete, to impose the structure of classical logic on the messy reality of natural language, leads inevitably to paradox, to situations where reasoning breaks down, where every answer seems wrong, and where the heap, like so many things, resists definition.